The Transfiguration, currently streaming on Netflix, was recommended to me recently, and I went into it pretty hesitantly because I'm not a huge fan of vampires. I have always cited that they are, horror for women. That I think that they were basically not a way to get women into horror, and I'm not trying to be sexist or misogynistic or anything like that. I just find that vampires appeal to women more. And so the typical vampire movie usually doesn't do anything for me. Even if it's good, it just isn't horribly appealing. So the movies that I usually like, Thirst, Let the Right One In, Martin, Stephen King's The Night Flyer, which I've mentioned in a previous video. Anything that's different and unique, I'm a big fan of. Even From Dusk Till Dawn is wonderful. This movie would fall in somewhere in that category, in top 5, top 10 type territory for vampire films for sure. It's hyper realistic. Milo is the name of the main character, and he is constantly talking about how much he loves realistic vampires. He's obsessed with vampires. He's this kid who is growing up in a poor neighborhood. He's around a lot of thuggy element, and he meets a young girl who has very low self-esteem to the point where she's letting kids in town take turns fucking her. She's cutting herself, and they form this kind of bond because they're both outcasts. And through the movie, he's telling about his love and obsession with vampires, and they're watching movies, and he quotes all the not all the typical ones. He's really into some of the ones I just said, like Martin and Let the Right One In. So it was cool to hear those name drops. And I think that what they pulled off with this movie is they very much stuck to the character in the sense that she tries to bring up like Twilight to him, and there's this joke in it where he's just like, this is stupid, it's not realistic, I hated it, whatever. And that's just it. It's, this movie is about as realistic of a vampire movie as you can get. The closest movie to this would be Martin, as far as the storyline, and as far as the feeling of the film, it would be more like Let the Right One In. Martin is obviously about a kid who thinks he's a vampire and really isn't. Same thing here, but the feel of this is more like an apartment complex, 2 young kids, one's a vampire, but, in Let the Right One In, she actually is a vampire, and this one he isn't. So it's kind of a combination of those 2 movies, which is excellent for me because those are probably my 2 favorite vampire movies ever made. The actors involved, the kids playing Milo and Sophie, do a great job. I really thought in the beginning that Milo was kind of miscast because I felt like his performance was so neutral and just kind of, dead on arrival. But as the film kind of progressed, I saw that that was his character, that he was kind of void of emotion, and that only Sophie's character could really bring any semblance of, emotion out of him throughout this film. I mean, besides in his interactions with Sophie, he really has no emotions or feelings of any sort. I definitely like how authentic this film feels. It's kind of got that Kids, that old 1990s movie Kids, where it is a very real setting, a very real feel. Actually, it kind of reminded me of Moonlight a little bit too in that way. So yeah, very, very, very authentic. It went very dark in places. It really kind of went into places I wasn't expecting it to. Some kill scenes that was like, oh shit, they went there. That's awesome. I really enjoyed I really liked the dynamic between the 2 main characters. They really are the main focus of the film. There's very little secondary characters. He has a brother, and then there's this street gang, but they're very, very little. They're very, very, very seldomly in it. So it's mainly focused. And I will say this is a slow burn. So if you're not super into like slow movies, this is not a thrill a minute. This isn't some fucking gore fest by any means, but this film doesn't need it. There is blood and there is some gore of some sort, but this is a really solid film. it's not just a good horror movie, but an actually good film in itself. I usually recommend films that, you know, in the horror genre that are good for what they are, being silly or over the top or gory or has lots of tits and hot chicks and stuff like that. This film didn't need any of that stuff because it's one of the rarer horror films today that's actually a really solid film on its own, and the horror element for someone like me is just a plus. Obviously something like this probably won't get a hell of a lot of attention in the critics' eyes because it does have that, you know, curse of being a horror movie. Ooh. But I highly recommend checking this out if anything I said sounds cool to you. If you like movies like Let the Right One In, absolutely check this out. Great film.